Vue 3 is finally here, and it is packed full of cool new APIs and tools to empower your applications even further. As developers, the more of these features we know and understand, the more powerful and feature-rich applications we are able to deliver. Now, Vue 3 doesn't actually come with a lot of breaking changes in relation to Vue 2. But due to it being a complete rewrite, some breaking changes were unavoidable and necessary. We will take a look together at the fundamental changes and core differences you need to know right now in order to take your Vue 2 apps into 3.0. Disclaimer: I am not going to cover Composition API because of time limitations, and because we've had access to it for a bit more with the Vue 2 plugin. Also, we have a lot of ground to cover, so, in the words of a famous dev trying to understand someone else's code. Okay, let's get started with one of my favorite changes and a core part of component composition, vModel. As you probably know, vModel allows us to very quickly and easily capture an input's value into the state of our application. Every time the user interacts or types in an input, vModel will let the parent know so that it can update our state. In Vue 3, vModel has gone through a redesign that gives us more power and flexibility when defining how this double binding should be done. In Vue 3, when creating a component that has vModel capabilities, we need to use a new set of defaults for creating the vModel binding. Let's take a look at a comparison between 2.0 and 3.0. In Vue 2, no matter what type of native input you were binding to inside the component, you would always bind the value of your data to a value property, and you will listen to an input event. Of course, there was a way to modify this default behavior by declaring a model property inside of your component, but that's the Vue 2 API, and we're not going to look in depth into it. In Vue 3, we now have two new defaults. For the prompt that binds the input of the value, we use model value, and for the emitted event, we use update : model value. I want you to pay close attention to the names of the events before you panic about the verboseness of these new defaults. Did you notice how model value is actually present in the both of them? The new emit default, update : model value, can be extracted into two different parts. The declaration that something is being updated, or the update : part, and the model that is being updated, the model value. This is going to play a very important role later on when we look at multiple vModel bindings. Now, let's take a look at how the code of a simple input wrapper component might look with the new Vue 3 vModel syntax. In Vue 2, we would declare a new value property and then bind it to the value attribute of the input element. Then, we would add an @InputListener that emitted an input event. Now let's do it again, but in Vue 3. First, we add our property, but this time we will call it model value. Same type, same defaults. Now we will bind to the value attribute of the input, but instead bind it to the model value property. Finally, we listen to the @Input event, but this time we emit an update model value event to the parent. The payload stays the same. Let's take a look at what this Vue 3 input component could look like now if it was a real component, base input.vue. We will set up our stub. Okay, as with any other component, we need to import it and declare it in the components object for our parent. Next, we add the component to our template so that we can declare the vModel on top of it. After, we're going to use the object syntax and use a data object to create a simple reactive state. At this point, you're wondering, well, that's all right and nice, but I already know this. Using vModel like this is now actually a shorthand. The binding has been modified to now accept an intermediate parameter before the binding. So vmodel equal my input is now actually short for vmodel colon model value equals my input. You're probably wondering at this point why this is important or actually useful. Let's now talk about multi-vmodel bindings and how this new syntax is going to play a very important role. A really interesting feature of Vue 3's vmodel is the ability to add multiple vmodel bindings to a single component instance. Have you ever created a complex component that emits an object as the payload, and inside the object you have a couple of different properties? Maybe you had to pass the parent a lot of information, which forced you to have those properties. Wouldn't it have just been easier if you could have bound to each of them separately? Well, although this approach is fairly common, it brings a bit of overhead in understanding what a component is doing or what you're supposed to receive out of a vmodel payload. Instead of being able to quickly see what's happening in the template of a component, you have to dig into the function that receives the payload and read through the implementation to figure out where each of the properties of the object are being used. In Vue 3, with the addition of multiple vmodel bindings, a complex payload is no longer needed. In order to demonstrate multi-vmodel capabilities better and to also better understand how it works, we're going to create a component called salutation name. This component, now shown on screen, will have two inputs inside of it. A select element that will allow the user to select their desired salutation, and an input for them to type their name. We will start out with the template by adding these two new fields, value bindings and some attributes. First, we will add a select element. Inside, we are going to set a default option for nothing selected. This is going to be our dropdown for the salutation. Finally, we will add an input element that will hold the name. Now that we have our markdown ready, let's take a look at our script. We already have a salutations array ready here to populate that dropdown. So we will declare a couple of props that we can bind to the values we already declared. Salutation for the salutation and name for the name. We will bind these two new properties on our elements in a minute. In the setup function of our component, we are going to return the salutations array that we declare at the top of the script tag, so that the select element can be for loop through it and populate all the options. So we will add the before here with item of salutations. We will then add our value binding, the key binding, and finally, the logic for the option being selected. Now we will add the interpolation of item as the text of the option. Next, let's make sure to bind the inputs value attribute to our name property. And finally, let's add the emit to the select change event. Notice that we are using the update:x format for Vue 3's vmodel binding syntax that we learned earlier. For the select element, since we're binding it to the prop salutation, we will emit update:salutation. Now let's do it again for the input element. Since we're binding it to the prop name, we will emit update:name. This time, we are updating the name property, so the emitted event will be called update:name. Now we can navigate to our parent component. We will import the newly created salutation name, and like usual, add it to our component's object. Now, let's add the salutation name component to the template and make ourselves some room to add the bindings. Before we go and add the bindings though, let's move to the setup function and create a reactive object that will hold our state. We will import reactive from Vue and use it on our form constant. The reactive function is part of the composition API in case you're not familiar with it yet. We can now add salutation and name as part of our state and return it from the setup method so that we can use it on the template. Now we can add our first vmodel:salutation. And we will bind it to the form.salutation state that we just exported. Remember that the :salutation bit here in the vmodel is tied directly to both the salutation property that we created on our component and the event update :salutation that we added to the select element earlier. Let's now go ahead and do the same for the name vmodel binding. Once again, the :name part of the binding is directly related to the property that we are binding to in our component, the name property, which is also tied to the update :name event. Let's go back to the browser here. Now that we have two vmodel bindings ready, we can open this. As I select something from our dropdown, you can see below in the form state that the salutation state is updated, as well as the name state when I write my name into the input box. You've probably already used vmodel modifiers before. Vue comes with quite a few out of the box. Let's quickly review the existing modifiers in Vue 3. .lazy allows us to listen to the change event of native inputs instead of the input event. Number allows us to cast a valid input string to numbers so that we get a numeric type instead of a string. Trim removes white space from each side of the input. Let's learn how to create our own modifiers by building upon the example salutation name component that we just created. We are going to first add the ability to pass in a modifier called capitalize to both of our bindings. But here's the twist. For the salutation binding, we'll go ahead and capitalize the whole acronym. For the name binding, we'll just capitalize the first letter. All right, let's head back over to the code. We'll start by adding the modifiers to our app.vue. Instead, the app.vue instance of salutation name. Notice that the custom modifiers are declared just the same as out-of-the-box modifiers by adding a dot after the vmodel model declaration and the name of the modifier. Vue 3 is now going to try to inject these two new prompts into our component. The first one, salutation modifiers for the salutation vmodel binding, and name modifiers for the name vmodel bindings. Okay, let's update our salutation name.vue component and add these new two props. We will navigate here to the salutation name component and scroll down to our props object. We will add one new property, salutation modifiers, and set to a default function, set the default to a function that returns an empty object. Next, we will add the name modifiers property. And once again, we will set the default to a function that returns an empty object. Let's look at all of this in a bit of more detail. On the code above, we're going to add our modifiers and see what happens to our props. When we add them, modifiers will be added to these props as booleans, which means that if no modifiers are received by the component instance, they simply will stay an empty object. If a modifier like capitalize is added, the object then reflects this by adding a true value to the respective modifier that was added. Now, with this knowledge in mind, we are going to refactor our components. Okay, let's first move the $emit declarations out of the template, and we will make functions that will hold all of our logic. Currently, both our emits are being declared directly in the template. First, we will add props parameter, and as the first argument in setup, and we will add emit for the second argument. Now, the second argument here to the setup method is the context of the component instance, which in return holds inside an emit property, which has the emit function in it. We are using JavaScript deconstructing here to extract only the emit function directly. But you could use context.emit as well. Next, we will add our methods. The first one will be update salutation, and inside we are going to extract the value out of the event, and finally emit the event. Next, we will add the update name function. In here, we're going to do the same, extract the value from the event, and finally emit the event. Finally, we will return both of our functions in a minute here, after we emit them. We are going to return both our functions from the setup method so that we can use them in our template. Okay, now we can head up to the template and replace our emits with these two new methods. First, update salutation for the select, and update name for the input. Okay, let's scroll down back to the props. Now that we're done refactoring, we can add some logic inside of our setup, update x functions, to modify the emitted value in case that a modifier is present. This is where the props that we've been adding earlier are going to shine, since now we can use this simple if statement to check if they are evaluating to true and modified our emitted value. We are checking here if salutation modifiers capitalize property is set. If it is, then we can modify the value to capitalize it before passing it to the emit function. Now we can do the same for the name property. We will check if name modifiers capitalize property is set, and if it is, we're going to do some JavaScript magics here to capitalize the first string, the first character of the string. You know, grab the first character, make it uppercase, and append the rest of the thing. And just make this a let. Awesome. Okay, that's it. Now we can check in the browser that everything still works. The dropdown is fully capitalized in our data object, and even though you cannot see it, I am not typing a capital letter when adding my name. You're going to have to trust me on this one. Okay, let's move on from B-model now and talk about another big change, $attrs. In Vue 2, attrs is a property of a component's data that includes all of the attributes that the parent passes into a component, with the exception of class and style. In Vue 3, attributes such as the type of a button can still be found in the attrs object. Also in Vue 2, we had this $listeners object, which included all of the functions that would act as listeners when the child emitted an event. In Vue 3, we no longer have the listeners part of the data object. This object has been fully merged into the attrs object, with a few key differences. Listeners are no longer listed as the exact keyword, such as click or input, like they were in the Vue 2 $listers object. Instead, we can find our listeners with their own event format, just like it did back in vanilla JavaScript. As you can see here, our click listener can now be found inside $attrs as onClick. A custom event would be onCustom, and even our V-model now shows here as onUpdate model value with the default bindings that we just learned about. A moment ago, I mentioned that class and style have special behavior. In Vue 2, they live inside their own component level properties. In Vue 3, they reside at the same level as $actors in the data of the component instance. Now, in order to better learn how to correctly use Vue 3 $actors in a component, we're going to build upon a plain input wrapper component. I've gone ahead and created the starting stop code so that we can dive right into it. The component includes both a label and an input element. They are both wrapped up inside a parent div, as we usually would do in a Vue 2 application. More on this later. The label here is bound to a label property, and the input element is vModel capable with the default's model value as a property and update model value as the emitted event. We can now use this base input component directly in app.vue. So let's go ahead and navigate to app.vue, and I've already imported a component and added it to the template. Now let's look at the setup function here. I've also created a ref of name email that will hold our vModel state and returned it so that it's available in the template. Now that we have a component to play with, let's look at what happens when we try to apply a type attribute to our component instance in app.vue in order to change this input to a type of email. As expected, we get the exact same behavior as we did in Vue 2. The type declaration has been set into the root div tag of the component. Now, if we add a class declaration to the base input instance inside of app.vue here, we will also get the same behavior, right? Both the type and class are applied to the root div tag as expected. Now let's go back to base input.vue and bind the $actors correctly into our input element using vbind syntax. Okay, now if we check the browser, we'll notice an interesting thing here. The input element is now correctly binding our type, but also the class. And now I know that this might not seem like a very interesting thing at face value, but trust me, this is a huge improvement in Vue 3 over Vue 2. Okay, so in Vue 2, not only were the class and style tags not declared inside the actors object, they were always fixed into the root of the component, in this case, our div tag. In Vue 3, we can use this ability to bind classes into components without having to resort to less than ideal solutions like creating a class's property. I think we've all been there. Okay, let's... Oh, by the way, did you notice this? Our class and type are still bound to the wrapping div tag. So yeah, inherit attrs false is still a thing. Let's go ahead here and add this to our components object in order to let Vue 3 know that we're going to take care of binding everything ourselves. So let's go ahead and add it here to the component. If we check the browser one more time now here, the div will not contain the bindings that we're setting for the input. Okay, now that we have our attr binding set up, we can take a look at how to bind listeners to our component. We currently have our component set up to listen directly to input events through the @input binding, but sometimes we want to allow the component to respond to any type of event that the parent wants to listen to, especially when we're working with native input elements. Okay, for example, let's go back to app.vue here and add an event listener for blur, the blur event, into our base input instance that will change the value of email when the user blurs or tabs out of the input field. We can now go back to the browser and test it out by typing something and blurring out of the input element. Now, if you had a lot of Vue 2 experience at this point, you might be wondering like, okay, wait, how is this happening? Because in Vue 2, we had to add beyond listeners into our input element to tell Vue that we wanted to delegate all the events other than the ones that had been manually declared and therefore overridden to our parent. This would allow our parent app.vue in this case to handle declaring the logic for when these events happened, like we just did with the blur listener. Now in Vue 3, this is no longer necessary. The moment we added our vbind atters declaration, we also added a binding for all the listeners that the parent passed into our component. Remember, $atters now also includes all the listeners. So in this example here, it will contain an onBlur declaration that holds the function that is setting email to blur at its code. Now, how convenient is that? Vue 3 allows us the possibility of creating components that have multiple roots or fragments. Note that you might also see them called fragmented root components. This was not possible in Vue 2, and some adjustments to the framework and API were obviously needed. So understanding these changes, both in how they benefit you as well as potential problems, will allow you to be able to write and debug any component regardless of the template architecture it uses. So we're going to build upon the base input component that we just built to showcase atters. Notice that we're still enclosing everything in Vue 2 style by wrapping the whole component in this unnecessary div tag. Also, I've gone ahead and refactored the input listener into the vbind object where the $atters are being bound. Now, making this component a multiple root component in Vue 3 is as simple as removing the unnecessary div tag that wraps our component. So let's go ahead and make the change and check in the browser to see if there have been any changes. Now, as you can see, our base input is correctly being rendered. The bindings are still in place, and the wrapping div tag is nowhere to be found. So that's good. I have good news for you. Now that we are working with a multiple root components, we can safely remove the inherit atters property completely. When we are working with multiple root components, Vue will no longer attempt to auto-inject attributes into the root node because there isn't a single root node anymore. Since Vue cannot safely assume which of these multiple roots should get the attribute fall through, it's just not going to attempt it. At this point, Vue will check your component file and see if you have $atters, the actual word in your component. If you do, then Vue will assume that you are in control of how the attributes and listeners will be handled. If you don't, you're going to get a warning. So let's go ahead and take out the vbind directive for a moment and take a look at the browser to see what this error looks like. Now, the wording is going to be a little confusing, but what Vue is trying to tell us is, hey, listen, the parent is passing down type, class, and an event listener through your vModel, and I have no idea where to put them. It's important that we know what this means in case that we run into this in one of our projects. Now, we know exactly where to look for the problem. Okay, let's go back and put our vbind declaration so that our component behaves correctly. If you were looking very closely at the error we just generated a second ago, you may have noticed that one of the warnings actually stated, extraneous non-emits event listeners, update : model value, and blur were passed to the component but could not be automatically inherited. If the listener is intended to be a component custom event listener only, declaring using the emits option, okay? So Vue 3 multiple root components introduce a new data level property called emits. Let's take a look at that. In more intricate components where you are not declaring a vbind $atters that functions as a catch-all declaration for your listeners, or in render-based components where your emits may be generated dynamically, Vue will complain that it cannot find a declaration inside of the components file or template for a custom component that you might be adding. So in these cases, when we get a new property called emits that sits on the data level right next to the others like component and setup, the warning reads, declare it using the emits option. This new property is in its simplest form an array. So if we were expecting our component Schrödinger's box here to emit an event picked into the box, we could just define it into a component like this. That way, whenever Vue instantiates our component, it will know that it may expect an event with a name picked into the box to be emitted by the component. A more advanced syntax similar to the one of props allows us to even set validators for these declared emits. So, for example, here by using an object format, we can add each of the emitted events as a key to the emits object. Then we can define it as null for now to avoid a validator like so. Now let's take it a step further. Let's add a validator that checks that the picked into the box event emits only dead, alive, or both. So the validator function, just as the one in props, should return a Boolean value to state whether the payload is valid or not. If the validation for the emitted value fails, Vue will issue a warning like this one. As always, remember that these warnings, just as the ones for prop validators, are not meant to catch errors, but to serve as a guide for developers that may be using or instantiating your component incorrectly, and to catch bugs during the development cycle. Okay, wow, that was a lot of content to cover in only 30 minutes. But if you like this content and want to learn more, I go over this with a lot more detail over at Vue Mastery. And please do not hesitate to send me a tweet with your Vue 3 thoughts and questions. Thanks for watching.